Hey guys, welcome back to That Florida Feeling. How's everybody doing? Hope you've had a good week. Thanks everybody for the follows, likes, subscribes, and reviews. You guys rock. Also for participating on the Instagram and Facebook polls. Technically they're polls. Yeah, we'll go with that. Apparently we all just like to go to the beach when we're in Florida. I totally agree with you. It's probably the best part. Theme parks are up there, but definitely got to be the beaches. And of course, we all agree that fall never comes to Florida unless you're in the northern panhandle. I would like to say I'm jealous of that, but I don't really miss the cold anymore. Nope. All right, guys, stay prepared, though. There is a lot of stuff going on in the Atlantic. It's still hurricane season, and it's kind of active right now, so just be careful. Stay prepared. Be on the lookout. I try to post updates when I get them on Instagram. Hopefully that helps you guys. Thanks for all the listens about St. Augustine. Did you have fun exploring the ancient city? I hope so. Hope maybe you still found a new place to go or some fun place to visit next time you go back. Today we're going to talk about something that I find super interesting, and it's not something that I feel like a lot is talked about in Florida, although it seems like it should just be part of Florida. Have you ever heard of the Loftus? What about the Atocha? Do they even sound familiar? I mean, they might. They're probably some of the most famous shipwrecks off the coast of Florida. And of course, we think that a lot of shipwrecks are like old wrecks or Spanish galleons, boats that we don't really sail on anymore. But that's not true. Not all are old. Because wrecks, again, still happen to this day in Florida. I mean, Florida even has an area called the Treasure Coast due to the amount of shipwrecks off its coast. And then, of course, along the Keys. So the Straits of Florida, hurricanes, coral reefs, shifting sandbars, and shallow waters have always made passage around Florida pretty dangerous, even for ships today. Sailors have always been afraid of sea monsters, mermaids, and pirates, but nature has always been the biggest factor that ships have had to contend with out in the open ocean and even around places like Florida, right off the coast. Shipwrecks around Florida have been recorded since the 1500s, and most come from exploration, sending crews to and from Europe, trade, sending gifts and crops from the New World back to Europe. And, I mean, most of it is, let's just be honest, most of it is exploration, when it boils down to it. It's because they were in the New World and they were getting all these things that is really the reason why we have a lot of shipwrecks, because they just couldn't stay away. And of course, the wrecks dot all along the coast of Florida, from the Keys all the way up the coast. And the cool thing about shipwrecks is it kind of tells us about the riches of the New World that they were trying to take back to Europe. It talks about the people who were sailing on the boats, the people who came before us, the type of people that were coming to explore the New World for the good or the bad, or the people that they were taking back. It really just tells us about the history before today. And that's kind of cool. Some are really, really well preserved. Some are not, but you can still tell when a wreck is a wreck. The people sailing with these waters, though, had a lot of they had a lot of stuff against them. They really did. The inability to determine accurate positions, inaccurate nautical charts, lack of navigational aids such as buoys and lighthouses that we use today, the ever-changing currents, human error, and of course, Florida's favorite hurricanes, has really added to the amount of shipwrecks off the coast of Florida. And there are so many numerous wrecks. It's counted to be over 1,000 wrecks in the Keys alone. That's not the rest of the coast of Florida. That's literally just the Keys. So no telling how many shipwrecks are actually off the coast of Florida. And of course, I keep saying off the coast of Florida, but there are actually shipwrecks in Florida. No, I don't mean the water came and went and it buried a ship. I mean that, there are shipwrecks in the St. Johns River, in the lakes that we have in Florida, and we have so many lakes. So it's really a part of Florida. Shipwrecks just kind of happen here, or they have been happening since apparently the 1500s. And so to me, it's something I really wanted to talk to you guys about today, because it is part of Florida. It's something that we really don't discuss, except for, of course, the well-known ones, which we're going to talk about later in this podcast. But let's start with one of the first shipwrecks mentioned. And the first shipwreck that was really mentioned off the coast of Florida is the Emmanuel Point wreck. And this happened was mentioned, I don't know exactly when it happened, but it was mentioned in 1559. And the Emmanuel Point shipwreck is actually a historic site off of Pensacola, Florida. The shipwreck is located at Emmanuel Point, hence the name, and it is identified as the Spanish galleon, the San Juan. The fleet was carrying Tristan de Luna and his army that he brought with him from Veracruz, Mexico. And the ships were unloading in the area that was supposed to be settlers for the new colony. Trade expenses, supplies, anything to get set up in Florida. But Florida being Florida, it was hit by a hurricane. Now, the ship and most of the fleet actually sank due to the hurricane. The site is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was added in March of 1996, so it's been there quite a while. And the site is actually two separate sites. There's the remains of two 16th century Spanish ships. Now, the first ship wasn't discovered until 1992, and the second ship wasn't discovered until even later in 2006. The second ship was discovered only 1,320 feet from the first one, but it stayed hidden longer. And the only reason they actually discovered the second ship was because a pile of ballast stones were discovered. And then when they kind of dug around or waved sand away, whatever they do, they found a preserved wooden hull from the second ship. And that's actually really cool because since it is wood, you would think that it wouldn't stick around as long or it would disintegrate due to the salt water and the shifting sands. So it was really cool that they even found that. Definitely from the 16th century, that's even better. Now, of course, we're going to talk about some Spanish ships, but the Spanish weren't the only ones to suffer from shipwrecks in the 1500s. The French also suffered from it in the 16th century. Really, anybody coming over to the New World kind of suffered them between the 15 and 1600s. But of course, the reason they did that is because everybody was coming to fight over land and new colonies. Now, the French flagship, the Trinite, was taken out by a hurricane. And that might sound familiar because this was the ship that was actually sailing to attack Pedro Menendez de Avilés and other Spanish colonists near St. Augustine. Jean Ribault had 7 ships in his fleet, and it was led by the Trinite. I don't speak French, guys, sorry. And was made up of 3 smaller ships and 4 larger ones to, of course, carry men and supplies and weapons. These are the ships that first stopped off at Fort Caroline, which is, again, near present-day Jacksonville. And then we're going to go down the coast to attack the Spanish. This is the same fleet that was going to attack St. Augustine at the same time that Pedro Menendez Avilés was going to attack. They eventually attacked Fort Caroline, but they were going to save St. Augustine. So the 4 larger ships were the only ones went into attack, and they were wrecked between Ponce Inlet and Cape Canaveral. The Trinite was not unloaded at Fort Caroline to help prepare for them for the fight against the Spanish, so there was numerous artifacts and weapons and everything lost on this ship that went down. And it was listed as having numerous ammunitions, armaments, and supplies that totaled 977 cannonballs, 300 iron pikes, 1,300 nails, and other tools including anvils, hooks, armor, and other supplies that would have aided them in battle and the repair of their colony. Fort, yeah, same thing, kind of. So the ship ended up going down in the storm, and the only thing that was really saved were some of the bronze cannons, and that was actually saved by the crew members of the ship. Now, the actual ship itself was stuck on a sandbar before the storm, and as the storm came in, of course, the waves ended up wrecking the ship. The rest of the fleet was actually wrecked in the storm as well. And the other ships were said to be carrying things like cannons, guns, cannonballs, and other hardware for the attack. These ships were also run aground and broken apart by the surf, so it sounds like they were one after the other. The loss of life on these ships was actually greater than the flagship, so the smaller ships seemed to suffer more pretty much all the way around. And the other ships are considered to be more scattered than the Trinite. And apparently, so the way it read when I was researching this was that the Trinite it was broken apart, but it wasn't as scattered by the waves as the other smaller ships. I don't know if that's because it was bigger, or if it was better made, or there was just more of it and it just didn't get broken apart. But that's one of the the main ships that was sank from France from France in Florida. Words today, guys, I'm telling you. Now, of course, Florida's coast is home to many other shipwrecks, but the one that stands out to me is the Henrietta Marie. And I really wanted to talk about this because this ship actually made such an impact beyond just being a shipwreck. So this ship was actually a slave ship that was carrying captives from the Africa to the West Indies to be sold. And the ship wrecked off the southern tip of Florida on its way home to England. And it's one of the few slave ships and possibly the oldest to be identified thus far. And wrecks like these are especially tragic because if a slave ship wrecked and there were slaves on it, they weren't going to be rescued from below deck. They were not thought of to be rescued. And that, to me, is just awful in itself. Now, the crew of this ship was only about 18 men, and the ship was built sometime around the 17th century. It was put into use for slave trade across the Atlantic, making 2 known trips from Africa to the West Indies. The first voyage took place in 1697 and carried more than 200 slaves to Barbados. The second voyage took place 2 years later in 1699, and it sailed from England on a 3-legged triangle trade route. Now, the ship was carrying trade goods such as iron and copper bars, pewter utensils, cloth, and brandy, and it was sailed first to the Guinea coast to trade for slaves before heading towards the West Indies. Now, it did make it. The ship did land in Port Royal, Jamaica in May of 1700, and it unloaded the cargo. Then the ship picked up sugar, cotton, and ginger to head back to England. Now, as it sailed out of Jamaica towards the Yucatan Channel, which is like the western end of Cuba, because they wanted to avoid pirates, and they wanted to catch the Gulf Stream back towards England. And, of course, this route was super popular for ships leaving the Caribbean to Europe. It helped them to go faster, and it helped them to avoid known pirates. Unfortunately for this ship, they didn't make it. The ship ultimately wrecked near the Marquesas Keys, which is about 35 miles from Key West, and the ship had no survivors. It also hid from salvagers for a good 3 centuries. The Henrietta Marie wasn't discovered until 1972 by a boat from Mel Fisher's Treasure Salvers. And if that name sounds familiar, we'll talk about it why in a few minutes. 2 anchors and a cannon were originally found, and of course more artifacts were found after another search a year later in 1973. The artifact from the wrecks include iron shackles. And of course, once these people realized that this was not a treasure ship and instead a slave ship, they were kind enough to rebury those artifacts and let them lie where they lay. The hull and the artifacts were actually reburied. The shipwreck was officially identified by its bronze bell in 1985 because the bell had the inscription, the Henrietta Marie, which is exactly why we know what the ship was and what it was used for. They've actually done many surveys and even pulled up a few artifacts to help shed light on the crew of the ship. They did find 2 copper cauldrons, which kind of is really cool that they found these because it gives light to the diet of the crew and the slaves. I don't know how you get that from those cauldrons, but I think it's really cool that they're able to tell that. Apparently the slaves were fed gruel or mush, but since the ship wasn't carrying slaves at the time of the wreck, it's meant that the cauldron was probably just used for storage. Although to me, when I read that, I was really glad that they were not carrying slaves at the time because that meant no unnecessary loss of life. I was actually glad to read that. All right, back to how they were eating with cauldrons. So basically, the slaves were fed gruel and mush, and the crew was actually fed like a decent meal, or as decent as you could get on a ship. Now, the legacy of the ship actually continued on, and in May of 1993, the National Association of Black Scuba Divers placed a memorial plaque on the side of the wreck. And the plaque faces the African shore and has the name of the ship with the quote, "In memory and recognition of courage, pain, and suffering of enslaved African people, speak her name and gently touch the souls of our ancestors." Now, this ship has been featured in a few documentaries. That's why the name might sound familiar. And there's actually an exhibit, or there was an exhibit, I'm not sure if it's still there, in Mel Fisher's museum. They put up an exhibit in 1995. I'm not sure if it's still there, but I'm sure if it is, there's probably some really interesting artifacts to show you about that time and to keep the memory of the ship alive. Now, the ships we've talked about have been pretty old. Of course, we talked about the oldest recorded one in Florida that we've found so far. But again, like I said, guys, there are newer ships that haven't made it around the waters of Florida, which seems really weird because of all the new navigational techniques that we have, and the lighthouses and the buoys and the updated charts and, you know, the weather. But no, the waters still continue to get people. The Amaryllis was a cargo ship that was actually built in 1945. And the ship was sailing around the east coast of Florida as Hurricane Betsy approached the state in September of 1965. Now, this ship was sailing from Manchester, England to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it had sought refuge in Riviera Beach. Now, the ship was actually going into the Palm Beach Inlet from deep waters in the Atlantic Ocean when a steering failure happened while combating high winds and rough seas. Now, the combination pushed the ship onto shallow waters containing a coral reef. Was just north of the inlet. So the ship ran aground, and it officially ran aground sometime on September 7th on Singer Island Beach in Riviera Beach. And of course, the hurricane hit the next day and ran the ship further onto the beach, making it almost impossible to move. Now, of course, you don't get to see a ship run aground on the beach every day, so it became an instant attraction for locals and sightseers. And what really, really helped this was the fact that the Greek crew played instruments as they waited for news or help or something. Now, of course, the ship also brought out surfers because of the waves and the change in the currents due to the fact that there is a boat now stuck on your beach, basically. And, of course, the crew remained on the ship until November, which seems really insane to me because that was September to November, and I don't know what you did, but okay, they sat there. The Coast Guard finally assisted them, and they were eventually sent home to Greece. Salvage attempts were made by the owners, and even a Miami man who purchased the ship after the original owner sold it when they gave up on it. Now, the ship was eventually abandoned, and it became a menace or a safety hazard because people were able to board and wander the ship. I mean, that sounds actually kind of cool, but I could see why it's a problem. The oil from the ship also caused a fire hazard and ruined the area around the beach for local businesses. So that could be a problem, and the ship was finally deemed to be causing too much damage to the coral reef that it had run aground on. And due to the fact that it was continuously leaking oil, they decided that they had to do something with it. So the ship was finally dismantled in August of 1968. 3/4 of the ship was towed a mile out to sea and sank, which actually became an artificial reef. It sits in about 85 feet of water. And the ship's hull and lower deck remain at the artificial reef site. You actually can go. It is an advanced dive site. So if you do go, please be careful and know what you're doing. Now, the next one I want to talk about is probably one that you might have heard about if you've ever really investigated shipwrecks in Florida or if you've watched some stuff on the History Channel. And I'm talking about the Loftus or Kashmir, whichever known its name by. It's known by both. Now, the shipwreck is actually a Norwegian ship that sank in 1898 near Boynton Beach. Now, the ship was an iron-hulled vessel that was actually built a good 30 years earlier in 1868. It was used for trade, especially in the East India trade, and for America trade, so it kind of went both ways. Now, the ship wrecked in 1898 due to a storm. It was actually on its way from Buenos Aires, Argentina, to Pensacola, Florida. The crew was made up of 16 men, a cat, and a dog. Yes, you always have to have a cat. They were all rescued from the sea by a passing vessel that was on their way to Cuba. The ship, unfortunately, was a total loss and deemed not removable from the shallow reef that it had wrecked on. The cargo, though, mainly lumber, was salvaged by the locals, and it actually was used to build buildings in Boynton Beach that you can still find today. So the wreck itself is 3/4 a mile north of Boynton Inlet, and it sits in 15 to 20 feet of water. So it's not that deep, and actually, depending on the surface, the tides, and the sands, it can actually be as close as 6 feet of 6 feet from the surface. So it'd definitely be something cool to go look at. It has large areas that can be covered or exposed, again, depending on the sands and the tides, the waves, the currents, and whatever hurricane comes through and tends to move things. Now, the hull was dynamited and scattered over 290 feet, 50 feet wide, and you can still see the 3 distinct areas, but they have been separated. So the bow, the midships, and the stern, they are distinct. You can see them, but they are obviously not together anymore. Now, what's really cool is this wreck has since become home to a number of marine life, such as Caribbean spiny lobsters, jackfish, porcupine fish, stingrays, and many other marine life have taken refuge here. Now, the wreck was put on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places and was also designated as the 8th Florida Underwater Archaeological Preserve, and of course the first in Palm Beach County in Florida. The ship was really cool because it still provided a detailed history of early 1900s merchant ships, and it allowed the marine life to stabilize in the area. You can dive at the wreck year-round, and you can find laminated dive guides at the local dive shops if you do want to check out the wreckage. Of course, it's only 6 feet down, so I'm assuming you could probably also snorkel if you're not into diving, and probably get a good view of what you're, or a good idea of the ship below. I kind of want to go there now. Maybe a weekend trip. Now, probably the most famous shipwreck off the coast of Florida is the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, or Our Lady of Atocha. The Atocha was a Spanish treasure galleon and is probably one of the most famous wrecks off the Florida Keys. The wreck happened in 1622. And of course, when it happened, the galleon was carrying copper, silver, gold, tobacco, gems, and indigo that was coming out of Cartagena and Portobello in New Granada, or Colombia and Panama as they're called today. The galleon was actually headed back to Spain after another stop in Havana, and it was heavily armed, but it served as the rear guard for the Spanish fleet, which basically meant it would float behind the rest of the ships to prevent a rear attack. Although loaded with that many jewels, I'm not sure if that would be a good thing or a bad thing. So the Atocha was actually built for the Spanish crown in Havana in 1620, and it was a rather large galleon. It was 112 feet long. Now, when the Atocha left, it was actually delayed in Veracruz because of the treasure that was being loaded to take back to Spain, and apparently there was a lot of it before it headed to Havana. Now, they left for Spain in September of 1622, which was about 6 weeks late and smack dab in the middle of hurricane season, kind of like it is now. So the fleet carried not only treasures, but it carried soldiers and crew, passengers going back, provisions, and of course the treasures from all over South America. Now, it's estimated that the Atocha alone was probably carrying 250 to 500 million in treasures that included silver from Peru and Mexico, gold and emerald from Colombia, and pearls from Venezuela. Who knows what else was actually on that ship. Now, the ship's voyage started out bad and just kind of went downhill from there. They headed into the Florida Straits and were quickly taken over by that hurricane. Now, the morning of September 6th, 8 ships out of the fleet had already sunk, and their remains lay scattered from the Marquez Key to the Dry Tortugas. Now, the Atocha lost all of her 265 crew and passengers, except for 3 sailors and 2 slaves that clung to part of the mast. Unfortunately, all of her treasure had sunk, as well as the loss of Bartolome Garcia de Nodal. He was the explorer who actually explored the Straits of Magellan and explored Cape Horn at the tip of South America, so he unfortunately went down with the ship. Now, the rest of the fleet eventually limped back to Havana, and the ships were immediately dispatched to salvage what they could from the Atocha and the Santa Margarita. Santa Margarita had actually run aground nearby. Now, the Atocha had sunk in over 56 feet of water. I don't know, 65 sounds better, I guess. So it made it hard for them to salvage any of the cargo or the guns, especially during that time, because the process to actually salvage things were not good. It basically just meant that you sent slaves down and prayed that they got something up before they died. So it wasn't a great process. It wasn't a nice process. And that's why most of it wasn't recovered. Actually, the salvage crew even ran into a second hurricane, which struck on October 5th. Now, the Spanish weren't going to give up, and after several years of using Indian divers and slave divers, like we just talked about, and through lots of work, they were actually able to recover nearly half from the Santa Margarita. And like I said, they didn't have the greatest methods for recovery, and a lot of them did die during this recovery process. Now, the loss of the fleet in 1622 actually caused such a massive blow to Spanish commerce and interest that it put them into debt due to ongoing wars because all this treasure had sank. Unfortunately, they would have been fine if they could have located the Atocha, but they never did. The Spanish never actually located or salvaged anything from the Atocha. So the ship sat on the seabed for years. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody could find anything from it. And it was resurrected when Mel Fisher began looking for it in 16. Wow. Apparently he's old. In 1969. He was actually working with Treasure Salvers, Inc. in a joint venture to search the seabed for the Nuestra Senora de Atocha. And of course, they searched for 16 years. They found and recovered portions of the wreck from Santa Margarita, but the Atocha continued to elude them. He continued to look for it, even finding a few silver bars from the Atocha in 1973, and a cannon that actually verified which ship it was from in 1975. As they searched, they continued to find emeralds, silver, and gold from the wreck, and officially found part of the wreck in July of 1985. The coins that were salvaged were minted primarily from 1598 to 1621, and they found many other dates even before 1598. Now, the dates and types of coins were mostly unknown before the salvage of the wreck. Sorry, I lost my place, guys. It's been one of them days. I'm glad it's Friday. All right, so they really didn't know much about the coins from before a certain date because we really didn't have a lot of artifacts from certain times. I mean, of course, a lot of them sank. They didn't make it. They were smelted down. So this was actually a really, really cool look at coins before 1600. So finding these coins not only meant riches, but it also meant a really good historical value. They still hadn't found the main portion of the wreck that held most of the treasure because most of the real treasure, or the good treasure, would have been kept in the rear part of the ship in the captain's cabin. And of course, they're still kind of finding treasure from this area near the wreck. Even in 2011, as an emerald ring worth $500,000 was found 35 miles from Key West, along with more artifacts that included silver spoons. Now, the Etosha caused a lot of news upon the discovery by Mel Fisher and Treasure Salvers, Inc. when the state of Florida decided to try to get their part of it, and they were going to claim title to the wreck. And they were going to force them to give them 25% treasure because it was found within the state or close to the state. I don't know how that works. So the treasure salvers fought, and they should have, and that's exactly what they should have done. And they claimed that it was theirs exclusively because they found it. So finders keepers, right? That's totally a thing. After 8 years of litigation and fighting, the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Mel Fisher and the treasure salvers, saying that, yeah, it is finders keepers, and they were granted all rights and all treasure in July of 1982. So they started fighting that in the 70s, won in the 80s, and continued to look around the site even to this day. Now, you can actually visit Mel Fisher's Maritime Museum in Key West to see some of these artifacts today. They are actually still working at the site of the wreck, and I mean, they're going to keep working. They still haven't found the main part of the ship, so they're not going to give up. I wouldn't either, especially not with how much is supposedly sitting on that ocean floor. And fun fact, you actually can visit Mel Fisher's website and purchase a piece of the Etosha if you have a lot of money. But you can do it. Now, they're constantly restoring and searching for more of it, and the wreck is actually in the Guinness Book of World Records for being the most valuable shipwreck ever recovered. I do actually recommend Googling it. It's actually a really cool thing to go on his site and read about it, and then to look at some of the coins that they're selling or that they brought up. They look really, really good for having sat on the bottom of the ocean for as long as they did. I know that they restored them, but still, it's actually really cool to be able to read most of the inscriptions on it. So, definitely recommend checking that out. Something different. Florida has so many shipwrecks, and they literally uncover them every year. Just more and more, because we don't even know how many is actually out there. Hurricanes come through and uncover long-lost wrecks and secrets off the Florida coast yearly. Now, of course, there is part of the Florida coast called the Treasure Coast, and it got its name because of a Spanish fleet that was lost in a 1715 hurricane. Now, the area actually covers Indian River, St. Lucie, and Martin counties, and it really got its name when salvagers began to come to the area to recover the Spanish treasure in the 1960s. The area gained international attention when treasure was found near Sebastian Inlet. So if you're over there and you want to take a metal detector to the beach, it might not be a bad idea. In fact, people still do that to this day. I was in Vero not long ago, and there was actually a bunch of people out there metal detecting and digging up the sand. So, new hobby, go for it. Or something fun to do next time you're in Florida. Now, since there are so many shipwrecks, and Florida is all about preserving its history, you can actually visit 13 of the shipwrecks in Florida that are under the National Park Service. Watch. Most of them are open, obviously, year-round. They're not charging anything. Nobody's sitting out over the water with a boat in a toll booth. So if you're ever into diving or snorkeling, this might be something fun for you. So the SS Copenhagen shipwreck is on a ledge of a reef in about 16 to 31 feet of water off the coast of Lauderdale by the Sea, where you can see a schooner-rigged screw steamship. Not really sure what that means, but that's the kind of boat it is. that was sent to the bottom of the ocean due to improper navigation. One of those fun things that we talked about why people wreck. There's the Half Moon Shipwreck, which is another popular dive spot off on a shoal off of Key Biscayne, and it's actually in about 8 to 10 feet of water and only 3 to 4 feet below the surface. This is where a racing yacht actually was wrecked during a storm in the 1930s. This is also Florida's 7th underwater archaeological preserve. I kind of want to go there. If it's only 3 to 4 feet below the surface, I don't see why you couldn't snorkel and see it. Sounds like an interesting place to go visit, especially if you're down towards Miami. The next place is the Windjammer Shipwreck, located in the Dry Tortuga National Park. It's in about 22 feet of water. And the wreck is a great place to see the marine life and fauna. Of course, the water is super clear down there. The wreck is actually an iron-hulled, ship-rigged sailing vessel that sank in 1907 as it sailed from Pensacola to Uruguay. No idea how it sank. You can visit the Bird Key Shipwreck, which is a flat-bottom steamboat and has the name Bird Wreck or Brick Wreck. Brick Wreck comes from the cargo of bricks headed to Garden Key for the construction of Fort Jefferson. The wreck happened somewhere between 1851 and 1861. They haven't really narrowed down the date. Probably won't. And it was salvaged as part of it was salvaged because you can tell that the machinery is actually missing from the wreck. The wreck is located in Dry Tortugas in about 4 to 9 feet of water on Bird Key Bank. You can see an abundant amount of marine life and fire coral at the site. Again, probably one of those you could go snorkeling and see it just fine. The USS Alligator is a Navy schooner that was used to stop slave trades and to combat piracy in the Caribbean. The ship combated against many pirate ships in 1822, and after Florida was acquired from Spain, it became responsible for protecting merchant ships off the coast. Unfortunately, the ship ran aground, and after they couldn't refloat it, it was set on fire to keep it out of the hands of pirates. The wreck is actually located 200 feet southwest of Alligator Reef Lighthouse off of the I've never said it right. One of the middle keys. And it's actually in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. It's in about 3 to 12 feet of water as well. Again, the water's really clear. I don't see why you couldn't snorkel over that. Another one is the San Pedro Shipwreck, and that was a wooden-hulled Dutch-built sailing ship. This fleet was headed from Havana, Cuba, to Spain in 1733, when, of course, they ran into a hurricane. Now, the ships of the fleet that could be refloated were, and the cargo was salvaged, and they all went limping back to Havana. But the San Pedro couldn't make it, unfortunately. It was burned down to the waterline, sank, and the wreck was rediscovered in the 1960s and had artifacts actually salvaged off of it, which is another cool look at history and ships in the 1700s. The site actually became Florida's second underwater archaeological preserve and is actually one of the oldest artificial reefs in Florida, since it does date back to the 1700s. The wreck is located in 18 to 20 feet of water south of Indian Key, and it also holds home to many different kinds of marine life. The USS Tarpon was actually built in 1877. It was an iron-hulled steamship that was sailing from Mobile on September... every time I see Mobile, I want to say Mobile. All because I had a manager who was from somewhere else and saw it and kept wanting to call it Mobile. And we're like, no, dude, it's the South. It's Mobile. So, sorry, side note. So, it was sailing from Mobile on September 1st and began to take on water as the seas turned violent. They didn't say it was a hurricane, but it probably was a hurricane. And the crew tried to jettison the cargo, but the waves continued to overtake the ship, and 18 of the 31 crew actually drowned without a radio call for help. The Tarpon is sank in Bay County, and it is one of the oldest artificial reefs that is home to many different kinds of marine life. The wreck is located 7.8 miles off Panama City, and it is in 95 feet of water. This is definitely one of those dive sites. And the ship is actually, again, one of Florida's underwater archaeological preserves, as it does give you a good look at ships in the late 1800s. Now, remember how I told you guys that not all wrecks are on the coast? Some of them are in Florida. This is definitely the next one that is. The Maple Leaf Shipwreck. It's not located off the coast, but within the state itself. The wreck is located in the St. Johns River. Kind of an interesting background. The ship was actually a Union ship that was transporting transporting Confederate POWs when it was overpowered by the Confederate soldiers, because why wouldn't it be? But the Union recovered the ship, and the ship was then used until 1864. When the ship was sailing through the St. Johns River, it hit a mine off Mandarin Point, and unfortunately the explosion killed 4 soldiers and sank the vessel. Now, the wreck was never salvaged, but it was eventually moved to its present-day location in the middle of St. Johns River, about 12 miles south of downtown Jacksonville. The wreck is a historic landmine. Can you guys tell I'm tired? I'm sorry. The wreck is considered a National Historic Landmark, and you cannot dive at this wreck. It is historic. There were people that were killed there, and if you've ever seen the St. Johns River, you know it looks kind of nasty. You not really want to go in it, or at least I wouldn't. But if you're interested, you can actually see artifacts recovered from the wreckage at the Jacksonville Museum of Science and History. Fun fact, I have seen the Jacksonville Museum of Science and History, and I would rather Google the pictures than step foot into that place. Sorry if you live in Jacksonville. I'm just not a fan of that museum. Sorry. Sorry. Getting over that, whatever. All right. Rant over, back to the podcast. So the city of Hawkinsville is actually a paddle wheel steamboat. And yes, I said city of Hawkinsville. That was the name of the boat. I literally had to Google it 3 times to make sure that that was really what it's called. And yes, that was the name of a steamboat. And it was wrecked in the Swanee River in 1922. Now, the wreck's port side is only under 3 feet of water, and the starboard side is under 20 feet of water. So it sounds like it's kind of sitting at an incline. The hull is almost entirely intact, with the piping and propulsion system still remaining in place, which means it was never salvaged. And the fresh water in the Swanee River actually helped to preserve the ship. So this is another one of those that's not on the outside of Florida, but inside of Florida. Now, the wreck is in the middle of the river on the Dixie County side, and it's about 100 yards south of the railroad trestle at Old Town. So if you ever want to go look at it, it sounds like you could literally just look into the water and see it. You can dive there. However, the wreck does require an advanced open water diving certification because of the fact that it's the river, so it's probably not the greatest visibility, and that you're only in 20 feet of water. So you definitely need to know what you're doing. This ship is also designated as a Florida Underwater Archaeological Preservation. Now, the Urca de Lima shipwreck was a wooden hull sailing ship that was part of a Spanish fleet that sank off the coast of Florida in the 1715 hurricane. Now, the cargo and parts of the ship were salvaged by Spanish, but then burned down to the waterline to sink it and hide it from the English. The wreck was actually found in 1928 and was heavily salvaged before the state of Florida opened the wreck to the public. Now, the wreck is actually the state's first underwater archaeological preserve. Sorry, guys, words again. They actually put 5 cement replica cannons and an anchor to give an idea of the size of the ship. So they're placed around so you get an idea of how big the ship was. The ship actually is really well preserved. There's a 50-foot ballast mound and hull timbers that can be seen or hidden. The bottom and sediment is constantly moving to cover and uncover parts of the vessel due to the currents, hurricanes, and of course waves in the area. Now, the wreck is the only remaining preserved ship from the Spanish fleet that wrecked in 1715. The ship is located in 10 to 15 feet of water, about 1,000 yards north of Pepper Park Beach in the Fort Pierce. It is Fort Pierce, yeah. Yeah, it's not Vero, yeah, it's Fort Pierce. In the Fort Pierce part of Florida. This is the reason that Florida has the Treasure Coast name, is this Spanish fleet that sank right there. That's the one that was found, and one of the many that was salvaged or brought in treasure hunters to the area. So this is one of the main reasons why we in Florida have a Treasure Coast, because of this shipwreck right here. Now, the U.S. C.G. Cutter Dane was built in 1936 in a Navy yard, so not all shipwrecks are old. The ship was decommissioned in 1985 and then intentionally sunk 2 years later in 1987. It is upright on a sandy bottom in 125 feet of water, about 1 mile south of Molasses Reef off Key Largo. The ship is an artificial reef and located within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And they say on a clear day, if you are in the water above it and look straight down, you can actually see the outline of the ship. So, again, probably snorkel above it and get an idea of what's going on, if you don't want to dive down there. Either way, that's a testament to how clear the water is down there, if you can actually see the outline and it's that deep. Now, the USS Massachusetts is probably one of the oldest battleships in the nation. The ship was built in 1896 and finally decommissioned in 1919, so it saw some action for quite a few years. The ship was actually sunk in 1921, and it was an exercise at Fort Pickens. The ship's guns actually still stick 3 feet out of the water. The ship is important for the environment as it now holds home to a variety of marine life in the area. It is well lit by sunshine and a super popular diving spot. The ship is located about 1.5 miles south of Pensacola Pass, and it only sits in 25 to 30 feet of water, which is why the cannons stick out of the water. And the shipwreck is also located in the Fort Pickens State Aquatic Preserve. So, Florida has so many shipwrecks. They help us to understand the past. They see what people were like before us. They understand the technology people used to cross the oceans, rivers, and large bodies of water, which, by the way, sound super terrifying now that we've talked about all these shipwrecks. It seems like you're just going and hope you run into something, or at least it does to me. Of course, these shipwrecks have provided great treasure, historical value, and of course, beautiful places for the marine life to help keep the coral and fauna preserved as well. Now, if you're a diver, you've got plenty of new places to check out around the state after you've heard about all these wonderful shipwrecks. And it does add to a huge part of Florida's history, since it did come mostly from explorers that helped to start the Sunshine State. Now, is there anything else you could think of that Florida's maybe well known for? Probably Florida Man. Yeah, I think Florida is most well known for Florida Man at this point, hence the name. And the Florida Man today is one that we can really all applaud. And this just happened not too long ago. And this is one of those, I really thought about doing it, but this guy actually did it. This guy got upset because there was a pothole in the middle of a road in front of his business. So when he asked the city to fix it, they said no, because the county wouldn't maintain the street since it was a private road. So he got tired of using cement and he planted a banana tree. Literally in the middle of the road. Just there it is. He wanted to make sure that no one gets hurt. He wanted to add a little beauty to the street, and he solved the problem that the county obviously wouldn't solve. I think it's kind of a genius fix. I don't really know if he can. I count him as a Florida Man, not because he was stupid, but because that's actually a really cool fixture to something. I wouldn't have thought of planting a banana tree in the middle of a street. I don't even know where you buy a banana tree. Probably nursery or Home Depot. All right, anyways, sorry. So I hope you guys have learned something new, found out somewhere new to explore, have a new appreciation for Florida history, or, now you want to explore shipwrecks maybe in your area or more in Florida. I want to thank you guys for listening. Don't forget to follow, like, subscribe, however you do it, to make sure that you don't miss your podcast on whatever platform you're listening. I appreciate you guys. Don't forget to leave 5-star reviews on Apple with comments if you have a second. It's greatly appreciated. As always, if you want to suggest or comment on anything, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also email me at thatfloridafeel@gmail.com. As always, guys, please stay up to date on hurricanes. Be prepared. Be nice to one another. There's enough going on in the world. Don't be mean. Look out for the next weekly question. And as always, that's your daily dose of sunshine.